The speech lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I know because I timed it afterward. Not at the event, I timed it that same night on the recording someone posted online. The one with the warm applause at the end and champagne glasses catching the light in the background. I watched it 3 times in that first hour. Not because I was looking for something I'd missed, because I already knew exactly what was in it, and I was calibrating how I felt about knowing. The event was held in a converted warehouse space in the Ashvale district, the kind that has exposed brick and high ceilings, and the particular smell of old stone being asked to perform as something contemporary. Expensive, restrained lighting. Catering that was understated in the specific way that communicates budget without admitting it. Isolde had always had a specific eye for spaces like this, the way industrial bones could be dressed in a register that felt effortless, as though the cost of the thing was an afterthought rather than the whole architecture. I should have paid more attention to that quality in her. The event was a launch, her first solo creative direction credit since the rebuild, a brand identity for a mid-sized architecture firm. She had spent 5 months on it, and it showed in the best possible way. The work was precise and clear-eyed. It had none of the excess that designers sometimes produce when they're working from a place of comfort. This was the work of someone who had been stripped back to what they actually knew, and had found that what they actually knew was enough. I had watched every stage of that rebuild. I had funded part of it, and driven to meetings for it, sat across from lawyers and accountants on her behalf while she was sitting in a hospital waiting room 4 hours north of the city. I had been the one who made sure there was always enough in the account for the next thing that needed paying, and the one who answered the phone at 6 a.m. when the anxiety made it impossible for her to wait until a reasonable hour to talk. None of that was mentioned in the speech. What was mentioned, in the 3rd minute, after she thanked her employer and the client and the team, was a name. Conrad. She called him her anchor. She said that in the hardest year of her life, those were her exact words, the hardest year of her life, he had believed in her work when she couldn't see it herself. Yeah, she said he had been the one who showed her that the ground was still there when it felt like it had disappeared. The applause was genuine. People who don't have the full picture respond to that kind of public gratitude with real warmth. It feels like evidence of something good. It feels like the story is the story she's telling. I was standing near the back of the room, holding a glass I hadn't touched. I didn't leave when she said it. I stayed until she stepped off the small, raised platform and was absorbed back into the crowd, until the moment dissolved into general movement and conversation and the ambient noise of a room that had moved past the speech and returned to itself. Then I set my glass down on a ledge near the door and walked out. Cerise. The air outside had the particular quality of late October in the city. Cold enough to register as real, with something beneath it that was damp leaves and old stone, and the exhaust drift of passing cabs. I stood on the pavement for a moment, watched 2 cyclists pass, watched a group of people outside a bar further down the street, watched the light from a window above me shift as someone moved inside. I wasn't angry. That requires clarification, because it sounds like the kind of thing a man says when he means the opposite. But it was accurate. Anger needs surprise as its fuel, and I hadn't been surprised in a very long time. What I felt was the specific quality of clarity that arrives when a long uncertainty finally resolves into a known fact. It sounded the way a financial model feels when the last variable is confirmed and the output stabilizes. You grieve the thing itself, but not the waiting. I had known about Conrad since February. It was now October. 8 months is a long time to maintain a folder carefully. I hailed a cab, gave my address, watched the city move past the window on the way home. I met Isolde 3 years before any of this, at a conference neither of us had any particular enthusiasm for attending. It was one of those design and finance crossover events that neither industry fully owns, the kind where the speakers are trying to be relevant to a room that is half trying to be relevant to them. The canapés were slightly wrong in a way I couldn't identify precisely. But the networking was aggressive in the way of people who have paid for a badge and intend to extract value from it. She was presenting a case study on visual identity for a renewable energy startup. On stage, she was direct and economical, the kind of presenter who uses silence as punctuation rather than filling it with sound. Most speakers are afraid of the gap between points. She wasn't. She let the gap exist, and the audience leaned into it. I introduced myself after. She told me much later that she'd almost been gone before I reached her. She'd already made her assessment of the room and was heading for the exit when I caught her and said something specific, something that proved I'd been actually listening to the case study rather than reading emails behind my expression. That specificity was what made her stop. We had dinner 3 days later. The early years were good in the particular way that genuinely right things are good, not without texture, but without the structural strain that comes when something is fundamentally misaligned. We had similar rhythms. We valued the same quality of quiet. She was building her studio, I was building a track record at Ashevale Capital, and we fit around each other in a way that felt less like compromise and more like actual compatibility. Her studio was called Herondale, a 2-person operation she'd built with a business partner named Petra. 4 years in, the firm had a respectable client list and was beginning to move into higher-tier commissions. Isolde handled design. Petra managed operations, billing, contracts, vendor relationships, as the practical infrastructure that allows creative work to exist at a professional level. I met Petra twice across those first 2 years. She was friendly in an effortful way, the kind of person who establishes warmth faster than it can be earned, laughing at her own observations before anyone else has the chance to respond to them. In retrospect, that quality was a signal. People who work too hard at the performance of trustworthiness are usually managing some gap between the performance and the reality. I noticed it and cataloged it and moved on, the way you do when you have no specific reason to act on a marginal observation. I wish I'd paid it more attention. The year that changed everything began in November, not the calendar year. What the year I now think of as a unit unto itself, 11 months with their own particular weight and their own internal weather, distinct from everything that preceded and followed them. Isolde called me on a Tuesday evening. I was at my desk at home, a valuation model open on my screen for a mid-sized manufacturing client whose balance sheet I'd been reworking for 3 days. When the call came, I saved the document and closed the lid. Her voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it before. Not distress, not quite. Something more specific, the flat register of a person who has just absorbed a significant blow and hasn't yet begun to feel it properly. The way a body goes quiet after impact, before it registers the damage. She said, "I need to tell you something." She told me about Petra. Their accountant had flagged it. Over the preceding 14 months, Petra had been diverting client retainer payments, depositing them to the studio's operational account as expected, then transferring them in increments to a private account in her own name. The amounts were small enough individually to avoid triggering automatic alerts. Across 14 months, they added up to a total the accountant was still calculating. She told me all of this in a tone that made me understand she hadn't told anyone else yet. I asked where she was. She said she was still at the studio. I said I was coming. The drive took 20 minutes, and I spent it thinking rather than reacting. By the time I parked, I had a working map of the immediate priorities. A solicitor with commercial fraud experience, the bank, a communication plan for active clients, while an accounting review to establish the full figure and the studio's current actual position. The fraud was damaging, but damage is manageable if the response is ordered and quick. The question was whether she had the capacity to order it, or whether she needed someone to run the immediate sequence while she found her footing. She was sitting at her desk in the dark when I arrived. I turned on a lamp, sat across from her. She showed me the documentation. The figure was £84,600 across 14 months. Retainers deposited and then transferred in careful, patterned increments, never a round number, never a large single movement, to an account Isolde had never known existed. There was something particularly cold about the methodology of it, the patience it required, 14 months of small and careful extractions from a person who trusted you, from a business you were supposed to be building together. It was not impulsive. It was planned. I stayed until 1 a.m. We drafted the immediate communication to the accountant. I reviewed the client contracts and identified the clauses relevant to a business disruption scenario, the ones that gave her grounds to maintain relationships through the investigation rather than lose them. I helped her draft a short, professional message to her 3 active clients, indicating that a financial administration review was underway. Nothing alarming, but honest enough to keep the relationships intact. She was functional throughout, present, asking the right questions, making the right notes. The flatness didn't lift entirely, but underneath it, she was still operational. When I left, Bentuan, she walked me to the door and put her forehead against my chest for a moment, and she said, "I don't know what I would do." I didn't answer that with what it invited. I said I'd call in the morning. I drove home through empty streets. The city at that hour has its own specific quality, the infrastructure visible in a way it isn't when the city is full of people. The signal lights cycling through their sequences for no one. The empty buses running their routes. I thought very clearly, this is going to be a long year. The solicitor's fees began in December. I referred her to a commercial litigation firm I had a professional relationship with through Ashvale, a firm that was expensive in the way that good lawyers are expensive, which is to say their fees were a function of their precision and their track record rather than their padding. Now, the initial retainer to begin the civil case against Petra was £12,000. Isolde didn't have it. Her personal reserves had been quietly depleted over the months she'd unknowingly been subsidizing Petra's theft. The studio's revenue had felt constrained for reasons she'd attributed to slow billing cycles. By the time the accountant identified what had actually been happening, she had enough to cover 2 months of operational costs, and not much beyond that. I paid the retainer. I was specific about the structure of it. We sat down together one evening and I said, "This is a loan. These are funds you'll repay when the situation resolves." She agreed without hesitation. She sent me a text message that evening. "I'll pay you back everything, I promise, once this resolves, all of it." I kept the message. And I kept it the same way I keep everything that has financial or contractual significance, screenshotted, dated, transferred to a folder on an encrypted drive. This was professional reflex, not suspicion. 8 years as a financial analyst produces a specific relationship with documentation. You don't record things because you expect to need them. You record things because the habit of recording is what keeps accounts clean. Both parties stay honest when the record exists. The record exists whether it's ever needed or not. I created the folder that evening. I labeled it with the year. The screenshot of her message was the first entry. It would eventually contain 43 separate entries, spanning 11 months. But that came later. January brought the hospital. Her mother lived 2 hours north of the city in a town called Dunmore, a practical gray-skied kind of place that smelled of farmland and damp stone in winter. She'd been managing a cardiac condition for several years. Known, monitored, considered stable. In January, an episode reclassified her from the monitored category to the surgical category. The procedure was scheduled for March. In the meantime, she needed monitoring, care coordination, and the particular kind of company that only family provides when health becomes uncertain. Isolde had sold her car the previous summer, a cost-cutting measure that had made sense at the time. Getting to Dunmore now required either a long train journey with a connecting bus or someone to drive. I drove. 4 hours round trip. I did it 5 times between January and March, occasionally more, and when her mother had a checkup, or when the anxiety required a visit without a scheduled reason for it. I want to be precise about how those drives felt, because precision matters more than sentiment in understanding what was actually happening. The drives were long. They were often late, leaving after work, arriving in Dunmore around 9 p.m., staying overnight in the bed and breakfast on the main road that had a persistent smell of toast and walls that held the cold in a specific way. In the mornings, we would go to the hospital or the care coordinator's office or her mother's house, depending on the day's requirement. Then, we drove back. Isolde cried on some of those drives. Not performatively, the quiet kind, with the face turned toward the passenger window and the hand flat on her thigh. She always apologized for it. I always told her she didn't need to apologize for what she felt. I meant that. I want to be clear about that. The tenderness was real. It existed alongside the other qualities of that year, without canceling them. A man can be genuinely present for someone he loves, and simultaneously be building a complete picture of how that presence is or isn't being understood. These aren't contradictory states. The drives happened. The money moved. The presence was real, and I filed it all, week by week, with the same discipline I applied to everything else. February brought 2 things. The first was a meeting with Josephine. She was a senior partner at Ashvale, one of the people who had built the firm's institutional reputation through 2 decades of precise, unfussy work. She had a specific quality that distinguishes genuinely experienced mentors from merely credentialed ones. She delivered difficult information in a tone that made it sound like professional support, which it was. The difficulty wasn't in the delivery, it was in the content. She called me into her office on a Wednesday afternoon. She had a habit of leaving a long silence before she began whatever she actually intended to say. I'd learned early to let the silence sit rather than filling it with preemptive explanation. She said, "You've missed 3 client calls this month." I had. One was a scheduling conflict with a hospital appointment. 2 were days I'd been managing the stages of Isolde's legal situation, once accompanying her to a meeting with the solicitor, and once helping her prepare the documentation the accountant needed for a formal complaint filing. I told her the truth. There had been some personal circumstances requiring attention, and I had managed the conflicts as professionally as I could, ensuring all materials were current and all clients had been followed up with by other team members. Josephine looked at me with the patient precision of someone who has had this conversation in many forms over many years. She said, "The review period is 8 weeks. Whoever shows up completely for those 8 weeks gets the position. That's the mechanism. I'm not telling you this to be unkind." I said I understood. She said, "Good." That was the end of the meeting. I drove home that evening and sat with the particular arithmetic of the situation. Kunz, what the personal circumstances were costing me professionally, what the professional cost was relative to what was being provided, whether the person on the other end of the equation had any visibility into the scale of what was being held on her behalf. I added a note to the folder that evening. The date, the name of the promotion, Josephine's exact words, the 3 missed calls with brief explanations, not accusation, documentation. The second thing February brought was Conrad. He'd existed peripherally since November, a name that surfaced occasionally in Isolde's professional world. Creative director at a firm called Red Veil Studio, well connected across the design industry, the kind of person who appears at the edges of industry events and seems to know everyone. And he had been introduced to Isolde at a networking event and had followed up with what presented as professional interest. He knew commissioners, had relationships with magazine editors, moved in circles that could be useful to someone rebuilding. All of this was plausible. Creative industries run on exactly this kind of network exchange. A well-positioned person showing interest in a talented designer having a rough year is not inherently suspicious. What I noticed was frequency. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of thing that registers below the threshold of immediate concern if you're not professionally trained to read pattern before you can name it. His name appearing in conversation a little more often than the occasion seemed to require. A text notification visible on her screen. Not something I sought out, simply something that was there when I glanced across a room. His name. And then again the following week. And the week after. I didn't mention it. I opened a new section in the folder. I labeled it with his name. This is the part that requires the most careful explanation, because people assume the motivation must have been jealousy, and jealousy would have clouded it, would have made me reactive rather than observational. Jealousy is a hot state. It distorts the information it processes. What I was doing was different. It was the cold state attention of someone trained to recognize patterns that don't yet have a name. You don't react to a pattern. You let it accumulate until its structure becomes clear. Then you decide what it means and what, if anything, needs to happen. I added his name to the folder. I kept watching. Was the settlement offer arrived from Petra's solicitors in late February, roughly a third of the total amount. Not serious, in the sense that it wasn't a real offer. It was a test. Defendant's counsel calculates the point at which the claimant's exhaustion and financial pressure tips the cost-benefit of continued litigation, and they make their offer there. A third of $84,000 was a message that said, "We think you're close to the edge." Isolde called me after the solicitor explained it. She wanted to take it. I understood why. The legal fees were accumulating. The studio was running at reduced capacity. Her mother's post-surgical recovery was extending the timeline of the Dunmore visits. The pressure was multidirectional and real, and a resolution, even a partial one, had an obvious appeal. And I said, "Tell me what you actually want to do, not what you feel like you have to do." There was a pause that told me she knew the difference. She said, "I want to fight it." I said, "Then fight it." I called her solicitor the following morning and told him to reject the offer. I paid the next invoice a week later. £7,400. I logged it in the folder. Date, amount, purpose. Then I closed the laptop and went to bed. There was a rhythm to the folder by March. Every Sunday evening I opened it. Not to sit with it emotionally, not to inventory grievances or perform a private audit of suffering. The way you review a position at the end of a trading week. Dispassionately, to ensure the record is current and complete. Receipts logged. Bank transfer references noted. Message screenshots dated and organized. Calendar entries from the Dunmore visits, the hospital appointments, the solicitor meetings, exported and saved. The Conrad section had grown. I had noted 3 occasions where Isolde had mentioned him in a professional context. He had introduced her to a potential client. He had offered feedback on a pitch deck she was preparing. He had connected her with an editor at a design publication who might be interested in featuring her work. All legitimate. All the kinds of things a professionally generous person with the right connections might do. What I also noted was one entry that was harder to categorize cleanly. She had attended a presentation meeting for a potential new client, a meeting I was aware of and had given her feedback on the preparation for. She came home and told me how it went. She mentioned that Conrad had been at the meeting, a connection of the client's, invited to add perspective. She mentioned it naturally, in the way you mention something you don't think requires special emphasis. She did not mention that they had dinner together afterward. I found out through a professional contact of mine, someone in an adjacent industry circle who knew Conrad by reputation and had seen them at a restaurant that evening. Not gossip. Ambient information. The kind that circulates in the city's professional layer without intent or agenda. I added it to the folder. The date, the discrepancy, the source, and their level of certainty. I didn't raise it with her. The surgery was in March, on a Tuesday, and we drove up the night before and stayed at the bed and breakfast on Dunmore's main road, the one with the toast smell and the thin walls, and the bedside lamp that flickered for a moment before settling. Her mother had made dinner for us, a practical and generous gesture from a woman who expressed care through feeding people rather than conversation. The procedure was scheduled for 8 a.m. We were at the hospital before 7. The waiting room had plastic chairs and a television mounted too high on the wall, cycling through morning news with the sound low. A coffee machine in the corner produced something that was technically coffee. The room smelled of cleaning fluid and warm electronics. I had a laptop. As I worked on a client valuation model I'd been given a deadline extension on, the extension having been necessary because of the conflicting demands of this same period. Isolde sat beside me with a paperback she'd brought, but didn't open. We didn't talk much. Occasionally she would reach across and place her hand briefly on my arm. The surgery was 4 hours. When the surgeon came out and said the procedure had gone well, Isolde put her face in her hands for a moment. Not crying, just releasing a sustained pressure that had been building since January. We stayed overnight. Saw her mother in the evening, pale and tired and already somewhat wryly annoyed at being confined to a hospital bed, which was a good sign. Drove back to the city the following morning. On that drive, on the motorway in gray late winter light, Isolde said, "I keep thinking about what I'd do if I lost her." I said, "You haven't." She said, "Because of you. I keep thinking, I couldn't have managed any of this without you." The motorway light was flat and even and slightly colorless, the kind of light that exists before the year has committed to anything. I said, "You don't have to think about it." I said it as comfort. It was also, I now understand, accurate in a specific and practical sense. She wasn't registering. The support had become invisible in the way that functioning infrastructure is invisible. You only notice the pipes when they fail. You never notice the pipes. She was not noticing the pipes. Gideon got the promotion in April. An internal memo. No separate conversation. In Josephine's professional language, that silence was itself a communication. There was nothing to say. The 8 weeks had produced a visible pattern. The decision reflected it, and further discussion would only have been either apology or justification, neither of which Josephine trafficked in. I sat with the memo for a while. The response I had was not the one the situation seemed to call for. There was no spike of anger, no sense of injustice wrongly delivered. What arrived, instead, was the particular exhaustion of a calculation that has finally returned its result, a number you'd been intuiting for months but hadn't wanted to finalize. And then, in the quiet after that, a question. It arrived without drama, without heat. It was simply, does she know what this year is costing me? Not as accusation, as a genuine inquiry. I opened the folder. I looked at the full picture, and legal fees covered £22,000 across the solicitor invoices to date. The initial retainer, the subsequent monthly billings, the document review charges, travel costs, done more trips, hospital parking, the bed and breakfast, fuel. Roughly $3,000. Rent covered. She had fallen 2 months behind on her studio rent during the period of financial disruption. I'd covered both, $800 each, $1,600, day to day. The weeks when the cash flow was too thin for groceries and utilities, and she hadn't asked, but I'd arranged. Harder to itemize, but present. Total, to date, $31,000 and change. And the promotion, a position with an expanded scope and a compensation structure that would have been, conservatively, a 30% increase on my current package. Not direct cost, but cost in the way that all opportunity has cost. I didn't present this to her. I didn't compute it to wave in her face. I computed it because understanding the full figure of a situation is the only way to think clearly about what to do next. I closed the folder. Went back to work. Elliot called in April. He was my closest friend from university, the friendship that survives on low frequency and high context, where you can speak every 3 weeks and pick up mid-thought. He knew the broad shape of the year. Petra's fraud, the hospital, the legal case. He'd been careful about how he engaged with it, present enough to be useful, restrained enough not to crowd the situation. He called on a Saturday at 7 a.m., which was unusual. I was already up, mid-run, and I answered because early calls from measured people are worth answering. "He said, "Do you want to tell me about the Conrad situation, or should I tell you what I've heard?" I stopped walking. The tone was specific. Not alarmed, not accusatory, the particular flatness of a person who has been sitting with a decision about whether to say something and has concluded that silence is the worse option. I said, "Tell me what you've heard." He told me. A mutual contact, someone who moved in overlapping creative industry circles, had mentioned it without agenda, as ambient observation rather than deliberate disclosure. Conrad and Isolde had been seen together on 2 occasions that didn't read as professional. Once at a restaurant, not the kind of place you take a professional acquaintance for a debrief, as the kind of place with a particular lighting and a reservation system and a general atmosphere that communicates something specific about the nature of the meeting. Once leaving a gallery event together, well past the point in the evening where professional obligations justify remaining. Neither of these, in isolation, is definitive, but they were consistent with the pattern already developing in the folder. I thanked Elliot. He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm not in pieces, if that's what you're asking." He said, "That's not quite what I asked." I told him I was processing it in the way that made sense for how I operate, building a complete picture before making any decision. He accepted that. He's known me long enough to understand that this is not avoidance. It's the only mode I'm capable of. After we hung up, What I ran for another half-hour. Let the rhythm clear the noise. Then I went home, sat down, and began a proper search. Conrad had been at a firm called Fenwick Creative for 3 years, ending approximately 4 years ago. His departure had been quiet. These departures always are, when the situation is managed rather than publicized. But if you looked at the professional forums from that period, the kind of threads that survive in archives, partial and carefully phrased, there were discussions about a situation involving a junior designer who had left Fenwick shortly after Conrad's departure. She had filed a complaint through an industry body. The complaint was in the public register, with names and specific identifying details redacted, but the company name and the approximate period were available. I found it in about 40 minutes of systematic searching. The language of the filing was formal and precise. It described a pattern the complainant characterized as targeted professional advancement contingent on personal relationship development. The mechanism it described was specific. An established industry figure identifying professionally vulnerable women, people at transitional or difficult points in their careers, offering meaningful career support and access, and allowing the personal relationship to develop as the apparent natural consequence of that support, while never explicitly stating it as a requirement. The complaint had been settled. No formal finding issued. The complainant had moved on. I sat with this for a long time, not with anger, with recognition. At the pattern described in that document, the identification of vulnerability, the professional entry point, the relationship that develops under the cover of mentorship and support, was being replicated with precision on someone I knew. Someone who was, in objective terms, professionally and emotionally vulnerable. Someone whose gratitude for the kind of support Conrad was offering would be enormous and genuine, because genuine vulnerability produces genuine gratitude, and someone who already had a man in her life carrying the actual weight, invisibly, in the way of load-bearing infrastructure. I printed the Fenwick filing, added it to the folder, dated the entry. Then I opened a new section. I labeled it Response. May was when the atmosphere shifted, not in any single event. In the aggregate of small signals, changes in register, as changes in frequency, the particular quality that appears in a relationship when someone is beginning to exist in 2 registers simultaneously. Isolde had stabilized. The studio had 2 new clients, mid-tier, steady. The civil case had a court date set for October. Her mother was managing the post-surgical recovery with the assistance of a neighbor and the weekly visits. The professional ground had stopped shifting beneath her. And she was, genuinely, returning to herself. That's a real thing. Watching someone come back from a sustained, difficult period has its own texture. A lightness beginning to appear in the voice, a capacity for forward planning that anxiety had contracted. She was making plans that didn't begin with, if things improve, but with when and where. She was laughing at things again, whilst she was thinking about her work with pleasure, rather than just with the grim determination to keep the business alive. These are good things. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Her recovery was genuinely good, and I experienced it as such. What I was also experiencing, quietly alongside it, was the shift in company. Conrad appeared in her stories more frequently, with an ease and a familiarity that was changing in quality over the months, moving from the occasional professional reference to the kind of reference that includes shared context, private jokes, the texture of a relationship with its own language. Most significantly, she had stopped monitoring how his name sounded when she said it. This is a subtle thing, and I don't want to overstate it, but it's real. So, There is a quality of self-consciousness when people mention someone they're managing their presentation of. A slight extra care in the tone, an awareness of how the name lands. When that self-consciousness is gone, it means the person has stopped thinking of it as something that needs managing. She had stopped managing. That was the confirmation I'd been building toward. I updated the folder. I made 2 decisions in May, and I made them cold. The first was not to confront her. Confrontation at that stage would have been a strategic error. It would have handed her a narrative frame, allowed her to position herself as the one being accused, me as the one being unreasonable or controlling, Conrad as incidental to the drama. It would have closed the information gap before I had a complete picture. And it would have made everything that came next a reaction rather than a decision. I don't operate well in reaction. My best moves are always premeditated. The second decision was not to leave yet. There was a specific reason for this, and it was financial and logistical rather than emotional. My name was still on her studio lease as guarantor. I still had half a year's worth of exposure through the joint household account. The solicitor's case was ongoing, and the outcome would determine what she could repay, which affected the loan I'd extended. Leaving immediately would have been emotionally cleaner and practically messy. I am not constitutionally suited to prioritizing emotional cleanliness over practical accuracy. So I stayed. I continued to be present in the ways I had been present, supportive, available, functioning normally. And I drove her to her court preparation meeting. I helped her rehearse for a pitch. I cooked dinner on tired evenings, and I began, in parallel, to build the infrastructure of a different life. Not dramatically. Precisely. The financial extraction took 4 months. I'm going to describe it in detail because the detail is the point. It's the part of this kind of situation that is almost never discussed clearly, because it requires thinking about money in a context where most people think you're supposed to be thinking about feelings. The feelings were real. The money was also real. Both required management. I had one joint account, a household operational account set up 2 years into the relationship for shared costs. Utilities, groceries, the accumulated friction expenses of shared life. I also held a guarantorship on her studio lease. The joint account was straightforward. I began transferring my own contributions out in June, small monthly amounts that were individually within the normal usage pattern of the account, covering my own expenses, drawing down my balance in increments that didn't create an obvious signal. I made no dramatic movements. I let the account drift toward a state where my financial contribution to its operation was functionally zero, which took 3 months of patient incremental management. By September, I had essentially nothing in that account. The studio lease guarantorship required a more formal instrument, a variation to the original agreement, removing my name from the document. It required the landlord's consent and a signature from Isolde. I told her it was for professional reasons, that Ashevale had recently implemented a compliance policy regarding personal financial guarantorships held by senior employees in client-adjacent sectors. This was not entirely false. The policy existed. I had applied it selectively and earlier than strictly required. She signed without question. In September, my name came off the lease. In the same month, I opened 2 separate investment accounts in my sole name, funds I'd been holding in low-yield accessible positions while the joint obligations were active, now moved into compounding long positions. Conservative, but correct. Money that had been effectively frozen by the ongoing situation, now working. By the time of the launch event in October, My financial exposure to her situation was essentially zero. The folder was current and complete, so I was ready for whatever came next. I sent the Fenwick Creative file in September. Isolde had taken a creative direction contract with a mid-sized consultancy called Wyndham Creative. Good fit, significant enough to represent a real recovery. She was pleased. She spoke about it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has come through something and arrived at a landmark that proves the passage was worth it. Conrad had made the introduction. I knew because she told me. Naturally, gratefully, with the warmth of someone describing the generosity of a person who had changed the direction of their year. 2 days later, I found the appropriate HR contact at Wyndham Creative through their corporate website. I drafted a short message from an anonymous email account, a new address opened specifically for this purpose, and with no identifying information created through a service that doesn't require identity verification. The message was formal. It noted that the sender had professional knowledge of an individual who had recently facilitated a placement at Wyndham and who had a documented history of professional conduct complaints at a prior firm. It attached the Fenwick Creative filing, publicly available, as the message noted, and described the nature of the complaint plainly, without embellishment or interpretation. It did not make accusations. It did not reach beyond the public record. It provided information and allowed the reader to make their own assessment of its relevance to their workplace. I sent the message, closed the anonymous account. I don't know precisely what Wyndham did with the information. That was not my decision to make. But I had transmitted accurate, publicly accessible information to people with a professional responsibility for a workplace. Their response was their own. My responsibility was only the transmission. The civil judgment came through in October, 3 weeks before the launch event. £61,000 recovered. After fees, a net of 48. She called me when the judgment cleared. Her voice had the quality of genuine relief, arriving in a body that has been braced for so long it doesn't know immediately how to release. The relief was audible. Not elation, something quieter and more structural. The particular sound of a weight that has been held for a long time, finally, formally, being set down. She said, "It's over." I said, "Yes." She said, "I owe you so much, for all of it, I know that." I said, "You don't have to think about it right now." She didn't. The launch event was a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the judgment. I arrived at the warehouse space at 7, took a glass from a tray near the entrance, white wine, cool. I identified the type without being interested in it, circulated briefly, spoke to 2 people I knew professionally from adjacent industry circles, brief and pleasant exchanges. Noted the room. Conrad was near the front, with a group of people who were clearly pleased to be in his orbit. He had a specific way of occupying social space, attentive, warm in a particular calibrated way, giving the impression that whoever he was speaking to had his full focus. It was a good performance, the kind that works very well in rooms where people want to feel interesting. But I observed him for a moment. He was handsome in the way of men who have always known they were handsome, which is a specific register of handsomeness. More about expectation than feature. Well-dressed, without ostentation, at ease. I felt nothing particular about him. He was a structure, a pattern, one of the components of the year's architecture. My response to him was not emotional. It was the same response I have to any mechanism I've studied thoroughly. Clarity without effect. Isolde was in conversation near the back of the room when I arrived and didn't see me immediately. When she did, she crossed to me with a smile that had a quality I recognized. the slightly performed warmth of someone managing 2 registers at once. She kissed me on the cheek and said something about the room looking good. I agreed, but we stood together for a few minutes. Then she moved back into the professional territory of the evening. The speech began at 8. She stood on the low platform at the front of the room. She had always been a composed public speaker, the same quality I'd first noticed 3 years earlier at the conference where I'd followed her to the exit. The silence between points used as punctuation. The voice even and clear. She thanked the architecture firm that had commissioned the work. She thanked Wyndham Creative for the professional home. She thanked the team members who had executed the work alongside her. Then she said his name. She said it with a warmth and a directness that left no ambiguity about what it signified to her. She said that in the hardest year of her life, he had seen what she was capable of when she couldn't see it herself. And she said he had believed in her work when the ground had gone. She said he had been her anchor. She looked at him when she said it. He received the attention with a practiced modesty, the particular modesty of someone who has prepared for a room to look at them and has practiced the response. The applause was real and warm. People who don't have the full picture respond to this kind of gratitude with genuine feeling. It looks like the right story. It looks like the kind of ending that justifies the difficulty. I set down my glass on the ledge near the door. I walked out. The solicitor sent the letter 17 days later. It arrived at Isolde's address by recorded delivery. I knew it would because he'd told me the timing when I'd given him the final documentation packet. The letter was professionally drafted. No emotional language, as no accusatory tone. The clean register of a legal communication that exists to establish a formal position rather than to score points. It outlined a claim for the recovery of documented loans made over the preceding 11 months. The total was £44,230. The figure was arrived at by reviewing the full folder and subtracting the items I had categorized, on reflection, as genuine gifts rather than loans, smaller amounts, costs that in retrospect I would not have tracked as debts, even if the circumstances had remained uncomplicated. The remaining items all had receipts, transfer references, and in the largest cases, specific communications confirming the loan structure. The message she had sent: "I'll pay you back everything, I promise, once this resolves. All of it," was reproduced in full, was with the date and the timestamp. The letter also noted, in a single sentence near the end, that the sender had ceased to consider himself in a personal relationship with the recipient as of the date of the letter. No phone call before it. No conversation. No face-to-face conclusion. This was deliberate, and I want to explain the deliberateness. Confrontations invite immediate reactions. Reactions produce heat. Heat is where accountability goes to dissolve. In the competing narratives, the hurt feelings, the confusion of the moment. A letter is not a confrontation. A letter is a document. It has a date. It has terms. It exists independently of what either party feels in the moment of receiving it. It cannot be argued with in the way a conversation can. It has to be answered on its own terms or not answered at all. And she called 4 times in the 3 days after it arrived. I did not answer. On the 5th call, on the 3rd day, I answered. She said, "This is unbelievable." I said, "The documentation is comprehensive. My solicitor is available if you'd like to discuss the repayment schedule." She said, After everything we went through together, you're doing this now?" I said, "Yes." There was a pause where I could hear her recalibrating. moving from the immediate heat of the response toward something more considered, because she was, underneath it all, an intelligent person. And intelligent people eventually move past the first emotional register. She said, "Conrad and I thought you knew. I thought you must have known and were just—" She didn't finish the sentence. I said, "I did know." Silence. Then, "Since when?" I said, "February." Another silence. The weight of that was audible. 8 months of silence reframed, not as obliviousness, but as observation. She said, "You've just been sitting on it." I said, "I've been getting clear." She said, I don't even know what to say to that. You let me go on thinking." I said, "I let you make your own choices. I didn't interfere with them. I also took care of the things that needed taking care of." She said, "And now you want money. After everything, you send me a legal letter." I said, "I want what was agreed, that's all. The agreement was yours, not mine. You put it in writing." She said, "I can't believe you'd reduce everything we had to a financial claim." I said, "I'm not reducing anything. I'm asking for what was documented. The rest of it is its own thing." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't have that kind of money available right now." I said, "My solicitor can discuss a structured repayment arrangement. The full amount is recoverable from the civil judgment net of your existing obligations. The timeline is flexible." She said, "You thought about all of this?" I said, "Yes." I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the desk. The silence in the room had a specific quality. The quality of a space after something large has been removed from it. Not emptiness, exactly. Clearance. I went back to Josephine in November, not to ask for anything, to have a professional conversation about the next cycle. I told her the personal circumstances had resolved. Yet she looked at me with the particular attentiveness she had, the quality of someone who registers what is said and what is not said with equal precision. She said, "The second review period starts in January, 8 weeks." I said, "I know." She said, "I'll be watching for presence this time. Not competence. That was never the question. Presence." I said, "You'll have it." She said, "Good." She opened a different folder. We talked about the client structure for the coming cycle, the expanded scope of the senior role, what a successful 8 weeks would actually require. The conversation was practical and clear. When I left her office, I stood in the corridor for a moment. The building had its particular afternoon smell, recycled air and printer toner, and something faintly of the coffee machine on the second floor. At the specific sensory register of a workplace that has a real claim on your attention, that requires your best rather than your remainder. I went back to my desk. I opened the valuation model. I worked until 7. Conrad stepped back from Red Veil Studio in December. I found out through a professional contact, mentioned in passing, without particular drama. Not fired, stepped back. The language of a departure that both parties prefer over the alternative. I don't know exactly what form the information I transmitted to Wyndham Creative took once it arrived. I don't know whether they acted on it directly, or whether it informed a subsequent investigation of their own, or whether it reached other hands through other channels. The specific mechanism of transmission from the folder to the outcome is not something I have full visibility into. What I know is that accurate information was placed with people who had responsibility for it. What happens to information once it arrives in the right hands is not my business. The first repayment arrived in December. The amount was consistent with the structured arrangement, which had been agreed through solicitors without any direct communication between us. Her solicitor and mine exchanged paperwork. An amount was agreed. A schedule was set. I noted the payment in the folder, Then I looked at the folder in its entirety. 43 entries. 11 months. A complete record of a specific period of time, its costs, its mechanisms, its evidence, and its resolution. I moved the folder into an archive directory. Filed under the year. Not deleted. Archived. So it's the kind of move you make when a project has concluded and you want the record preserved but no longer active, no longer something you open and update, something you move to where documents go when their purpose has been served. I closed the drive. Josephine offered me the senior position in January. The second review cycle had produced a different pattern from the first. Consistent presence, no conflicts, full engagement with the client-facing scope. Consistent presence is unremarkable, which is the point. It's only inconsistency that gets noticed. Showing up is invisible until you stop. She gave me the details in her office: compensation, scope, expected responsibilities. She delivered it in her usual manner, unhurried, precise, leaving the appropriate silences. At the end of the meeting, and she said, "There's something different about how you operate this year. I can't put it precisely, but it reads as someone who has made a decision about what their attention is for." I said, "I had a useful year." She considered that. She said, "Good, let's get to work." I ran into Isolde once, in February. Not arranged. The city folds in on itself in the ways that produce these encounters: shared professional geography, overlapping routes. She was at a coffee shop I was passing on a road I don't usually take. She was alone, laptop open, a coffee that had gone mostly undrunk beside it. She was working on something, design files from the look of the screen. She saw me through the glass. There was a moment, the kind where both people register the encounter simultaneously and run the calculation about what to do with it. I kept walking, but not quickly, not with any performance of either avoidance or indifference, just walking, the walk of a man going somewhere with no particular reason to stop. The coffee shop moved behind me. I turned at the corner. The street continued. Foot traffic, a delivery vehicle making slow progress, pigeons doing their specific work on a stretch of pavement outside a newsagent. The ordinary operational texture of a city that contains both of us and is indifferent to the fact. Mine was the only life I was managing. Elliot called in March. He wanted to know how things stood. He'd been careful through the winter, checking in without pressing, respecting the particular form of processing that takes place in the period after something has concluded. I told him the position had come through. I told him the repayment arrangement was current. And I told him I was clear. He said, "And the whole year of it, you all right with it?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "It was an education." He said, "In what, exactly?" I thought about the Dunmore drives, the hospital waiting room, the Sunday evenings with the folder, the financial extraction done in careful increments over 4 months, the Fenwick filing, the solicitor's letter, the call that followed it. I said, "In the cost of invisible work, in the specific way that load-bearing things don't get credited, because load-bearing things are supposed to be invisible, and in why documentation isn't pessimism, it's just clarity." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You know what I kept thinking, all through it." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I kept thinking she had no idea who she had." I thought about that, but I said, "She knew." He said, "Yeah?" I said, "She had the full figure. She'd agreed to the terms. She sent the message. She knew what the arrangement was. She just decided at some point that the arrangement could be renegotiated without notice." He said, "That's worse than not knowing." I said, "It's just accurate." The last repayment arrived in April. The full remaining balance, transferred cleanly, ahead of the scheduled final date. I don't know whether that was a gesture of some kind, an attempt at a conclusion that felt more deliberate than a simple scheduled payment. It may have been purely practical. Her cash position had presumably improved since December, and clearing the debt ahead of schedule reduces the ongoing administrative weight of it. I noted it in the archived folder. Date, amount, final entry. And then I closed the archive entirely. I sat for a moment with the clean desktop. No open files, no running calculations, no documentation in active use. I thought about the year. Not with nostalgia, not with satisfaction exactly, more with the neutral assessment you give a completed piece of work. The year had required sustained, precise attention across multiple simultaneous domains. The legal documentation, the financial extraction, the professional maintenance, the Conrad research, the anonymous transmission, the solicitor's letter and its aftermath. None of it had been loud. None of it had required confrontation, performance, or the kind of visible drama that makes for a clean narrative. It had been methodical, patient, and complete. The work was done. I went for a run. As the city in April has a specific quality. The rain from overnight still in the pavement, but the air carrying something underneath it that is the beginning of spring. The smell of wet earth from the parks. Light that is trying to be longer than it currently is. Everything at a threshold. I ran the route I usually run. Past the park with the old oak at the entrance, down along the canal, where the water holds the early light in a way that is briefly very clean. Back through the grid of streets near my building, where the morning is assembling itself in the ordinary way, a window opening, a bakery venting into the cold air, two people walking dogs in the opposite direction, exchanging the brief, wordless acknowledgement of people sharing the same early hour. I ran for 40 minutes. I came home, I made coffee. Whilst I sat at my desk in the morning light with the window partly open and the street beginning its day below. A bin lorry making its slow progress. A cyclist weaving around it, a woman with a child, the child stopping to look at something on the ground with the total absorption children have for things adults have stopped seeing. Ordinary things. The most reliable things. I drank my coffee. Outside, the street continued. Nothing pending, nothing owed. Just a man at his desk, in his city, at the beginning of a different kind of year.
Do it for the boys. Right now, I have it so that I have the costume set up as a channel point redemption for me to wear it for like, I think I said 20 minutes or something like that. But if people come in today and want to see me put it on without having the channel points, then that's fine. My wife rolled her eyes at the fact that I bought it, and then my son looked at me like it came in the mail yesterday, last night, and I pulled it out of the package and I set it on the table, and my son saw it and he's like, "What is that?" And I said, "It's a new hot dog costume," and he just looked at me like, "What the fuck is wrong with you, Dad? You're delusional. You haven't slept."